we need to talk about Richarlison. No, not the pigeon dance, not his bright white hair, not even his love of pyrotechnics. We need to talk about Richarlison's 3 Keepie-Uppies after coming on against Nottingham Forest, the subsequent foul on him by Brennan Johnson only seconds later, the reaction to those 2 events, and what they tell us about British footballing culture and the British psyche in general. No, I am being deadly serious. Because I think that in that one act of doing a few Keepie-Uppies out on a football pitch, which seems so banal when you put it like that, Richarlison exposed more about modern Britain than any focus group, YouGov poll, or general election ever could. If you were watching the game on Sky Sports, like me, then you will have heard Martin Tyler and Jamie Carragher's assessment of what happened. For those of you who weren't watching, and perhaps haven't even seen the incident that I'm referring to, which doesn't really matter, you don't have to have seen it for this video to make sense, but I will quickly explain what happened nonetheless. In the 85th minute of the game, shortly after Tottenham Hotspur had taken a 2-0 lead away at Nottingham Forest, second half substitute Richarlison juggled the ball a few times before laying it off. And when it was returned to him just a second later, Brennan Johnson basically kicked him. It wasn't a leg breaker or some mad 2-footed tackle, but it was obviously a cynical attempt to foul Richarlison rather than to play the ball. And as such, Tottenham were awarded with a free kick, and Johnson went into the referee's book. The correct call. All very straightforward. Thank you for watching today's video. Well, not quite, because during the live commentary, Martin Tyler stated, "That's what you get for showboating at this level." Meanwhile, Carragher said, "What do you expect him to do? You're not condoning that, but a big Premier League game, passions are running high, and someone starts taking the mick," before suggesting that if Johnson had actually injured Richarlison, deliberately, in response to Richarlison's showboating, then that would have been Richarlison's own fault. In other words, we're not condoning it, but that is exactly what we are doing. The following day, the festering swamp of idiocy, otherwise known as TalkSport, in their perpetual pursuit of turning their listeners' brains into collective mush, ran an entire segment on whether or not showboating should be a yellow card offence. To which, the obvious questions that I am going to attempt to answer in this video are, why is England like this? When did it happen? And what can be done to help people with such severe brain rot? There are, if you like, 2 issues at hand here. One is the technical question in regards to the laws of the game, and the other is the real-world application, which is more subjective, where different people are likely to have different opinions on what is justified in their minds, even if it is not within the laws of the game. The first question is very straightforward. There are no laws prohibiting footballers from doing Keepie-Uppies, therefore, at least as per the official laws of the game, there is absolutely nothing wrong with what Richarlison did. Juggling the ball is no different to doing a step over or a rabona in that respect, whereas kicking or tripping an opponent obviously is a foul, particularly whilst making no attempt to play the ball, hence why the referee, quite rightly, awarded Tottenham with a free kick and gave Johnson a yellow card. So then we move on to the second question. The argument that some people have made is that, whilst, yes, Johnson was technically in the wrong and Richarlison was not, Richarlison was being disrespectful, and therefore, either at the more reasonable end of the spectrum, you can understand Johnson's reaction, or even that his response was the right one, and at the less reasonable end of the spectrum, you do have some people who think that Johnson should have broken both of Richarlison's legs, followed him home from the game, and thrown his entire family into a wood chipper, like in the final scene of Fargo. You can probably tell by this stage that, personally, and I know that I won't be popular with some people for saying it, I don't think that Richarlison deserved to have his shin split open, his legs broken, or even sustain any kind of potentially career-ending injury for juggling the ball. Football has become, particularly over the last 10 to 20 years, so methodical, so systemised, and so athletic, that we tend to forget that football is, first and foremost, a form of entertainment. Although the standard of football that is played now, at the elite level, is extraordinarily high, and the degree of professionalism is without precedent, there is at least an element of entertainment that has been eroded. I would argue, in fact, that a great deal of it has been eroded, whether that be the excitement that used to come from there being a much smaller gap between the divisions and the top and bottom teams within any given league, the unpredictability of different teams having totally contrasting styles of play and not knowing anywhere near as much about their opponents before playing them, and indeed, the entertainment provided by the players themselves, who used to be given far more freedom to go out and express themselves, make mistakes, and attempt the audacious. In that sense, showboating, which is, let's face it, what Richarlison was doing, albeit not a particularly flamboyant or egregious case of showboating in my opinion, is a bit of a throwback. It's something that we don't see very often in football anymore, and particularly within English football, where it has been frowned upon for at least all of my lifetime. I have seen a lot of people make the case, a bit like Martin Tyler alluded to, that you ought to expect to be nobbled if you do anything like Richarlison did in the Premier League. There is a sense, among some, that it is almost like a British tradition. Think you can take the piss out of me, do you? Well, have a bit of this. Wallop. You get the idea. Maybe you can get away with that kind of thing over in Brazil, Richie, but if you try that at Stoke City or Burnley, you're going straight into Row Z. This is, as Jose Mourinho might put it, football heritage. Except, it isn't. Great Britain and Northern Ireland is actually a nation with a very proud tradition of showboating. Not only was football invented in Britain, so too was showboating at roughly the same time in fact. George Best used to dribble past an opponent, check, wait for them to get back goal side of him, and then beat them again, purely out of showmanship, to entertain the crowd, and to show that he could. Rach Carter used to trap the ball, mid-game, and gesture towards the opposition, inviting them to come and get the ball off him if they thought that they could. Almost like a boxer, throwing his hands up in the air or holding them behind his head to taunt an opponent. Sometimes, if Carter didn't agree with a refereeing decision, he would walk straight off the pitch and go and sit in the stands with supporters for a few minutes, purely in protest. Len Shackleton, Britain's greatest ever showboater, was backheeling penalties in the 1940s and 50s. Shackleton used to torment his opponents by playing 1-2s with the corner flag, quite literally sitting down on the ball in the middle of a game, and once famously trapping the ball in a game against Arsenal, looking at his wrist as though he were checking the time before pulling a comb out of his pocket and combing his hair while still in possession of the ball. Best, Carter and Shackleton are three of the greatest footballers that Britain has ever produced. They were adored by their own supporters and by a great many neutrals for the entertainment that they provided. Their mere presence would add thousands to the attendance wherever they happened to be playing on any given weekend, in the days before football was widely televised, as everyone wanted to catch a glimpse of Best humiliating a fullback or Shackleton clowning around. It wasn't as though everyone loved their antics or that there weren't any consequences. All three players were on the receiving end of some brutal challenges throughout the course of their careers, and one England selector once remarked that Shackleton had been left out of the England squad because England played their games at Wembley Stadium, not at the London Palladium. Britain has always had a complicated relationship with maverick footballers, from Rodney Marsh through to Charlie George. That much is certainly true, but they are also some of the most celebrated and popular players of our past. We might think of Richarlison's antics as being quintessentially Brazilian, and in some respects they are. It is often said that the English invented football, but the Brazilians perfected it, and nowadays, attributes like flair and flamboyance are synonymous with the samba stars of South America. But to believe that there has always been a hatred of showboating in Britain, or that it is a tradition that predates even the 1980s, is simply not to know your history of British football. The beautiful game, or o jogo bonito, as Brazilians call it, is synonymous in Brazil with superfluous and unnecessary acts of skill, flamboyance, and, sure, even arrogance if you like. But we ought not forget that it was Stanley Matthews, an Englishman, and the man that they called the Wizard of the Dribble, who Pelé, who popularised the term O Jogo Bonito, described as being, quote, the man who taught us the way football should be played. I wouldn't wish to confide solely in tradition though, and the misconceptions around it, so it is worth noting that Brazil, where that culture is still celebrated and flourishes rather than being chastised, have won the World Cup a record 5 times. Meanwhile, England have won the World Cup just once, on home soil, in rather dubious circumstances, almost 60 years ago, so perhaps unnecessary acts of skill, flair, and flamboyance, designed to entertain and even amuse above all else, isn't actually an evil akin to kidnapping someone's child or trying to start a race war. And maybe, just maybe, England would be better served by taking a leaf out of Brazil's book, or heck, even just out of our own book prior to the 1980s. To be clear, I am not saying that the reason England haven't won the World Cup is because Harry Maguire doesn't showboat enough, or that if Declan Rice does a few Keepie-Uppies in Qatar, we are going to have the rest of the world on strings. This is a much broader point relating to footballing cultures and attitudes towards certain behaviour. In Britain, or at least in England, more so than anywhere else in my experience, there is a very strange yet quite clearly defined hierarchy when it comes to cheating. Whilst the laws of the game dictate how grievous an offence is and therefore how it should be punished, there is a perception in England that, despite the fact that we wrote those laws and most of them have remained unchanged over the last 150 years, they're not quite right. Diving, for example, is just about the most deplorable act of cheating imaginable, and anyone who does it deserves to be chastised for the rest of their lives. But, cynically scything someone down when the opposition is on the counter-attack, well, that is just a professional foul and is smart game management. Yellow card. Well done. The most obvious example of this hierarchy of cheating, which, again, dates back to the 1980s, is in regard to Diego Maradona's handball against England at the 1986 World Cup. Clearly, Maradona cheated against England and got away with it. The officials did not do their job, and England had every right to feel aggrieved. However, virtually nothing is ever said of the equally blatant cheating by the England players in that game, who repeatedly meted out incredibly brutal fouls on Maradona, even by the standards of the day, some of which very well could have resulted in injury, and even appear to have been intended to cause damage. Now, as far as I'm concerned, and I know that this will probably result in the Queen revoking my passport and Priti Patel stripping me of my citizenship, but kicking the shit out of someone and trying deliberately to hurt them is as egregious, if not more so in the latter case, than using your hand to score a goal. Sure, both are cheating, both are wrong, and both ought to have been spotted and punished by the officials. Yet, in England, what I'm saying right now is borderline treasonous. A swan has most likely just died out of outrage. Winston Churchill is quite literally rolling in his grave. Jeremy Clarkson has defecated his own bedsheets. That last one is unrelated to my comments about the 1986 World Cup, but you get the general idea. The case of Richarlison is even more extreme than this because what he did, showboating, isn't even a form of cheating at all. Yet, he is still somehow the villain in this piece and has committed the more offensive act than the player who actually fouled him. The response, therefore, has been nothing short of psychopathic. I tweeted about Jamie Carragher's condemnation of Richarlison whilst the game was still on, and his ridiculous suggestion that the Brazilian would have been somehow culpable had a Nottingham Forest player deliberately injured him. For anyone to infer that is stupid, but for a former professional who made his living playing the game and still makes his living off the back of having had a lengthy and successful career within the sport, to come out with something like that really beggars belief. And I don't mind Jamie Carragher as a pundit, unlike a lot of people. I actually quite like him, and I think that he tends to be pretty measured and reasonable. It is worth noting that Carragher did not have the worst take within the media on Richarlison's showboating. Oh no, far from it. I mentioned TalkSport doing a segment on whether showboating ought to be a yellow card offence. presumably followed by back heels and then goal celebrations, and Laura Woods, who, again, is normally the sane one on TalkSport, who acts as a counterbalance to the likes of Jamie O'Hara, Gabrielle Agbonlahor and Simon Jordan, so that they retain a slight veneer of respectability, said that Johnson had, and I quote, made himself somewhat of a hero to every other fan out there who isn't a Spurs fan, with Ali McCoist chirping in for added emphasis by stating, in the world. Really? A hero? I know that term has become somewhat diminished in recent years, but I thought that it still demanded a little bit more than getting a yellow card for kicking someone. Listen, Brennan Johnson is a brilliant player, still aged only 21, and he was outstanding in the Championship last season. I'm not actually having too much of a go at him. He's young, inexperienced, and he was no doubt frustrated that Forest had just gone 2-0 down after Steve Cook inexplicably decided to start playing volleyball inside of his own 6-yard box during a game in which Forest had actually given a really decent account of themselves. He didn't go in to hurt Richarlison, it wasn't a 2-footed lunge or anything particularly outrageous. He just lost his head for a split second and committed a silly foul which hopefully he will learn from. It's also really worth emphasising the fact that what Johnson did was exactly what Spurs fans, players, and coaching staff would have wanted him to do in that situation. He gave away a stupid foul, got himself booked, and gave Tottenham a free kick in a decent area, which is precisely what you want as a team when you're looking to run down the clock. Even if you hate Richarlison, you hate showboating, and you think that anyone who does Keepie-Uppies should be immediately castrated and then shot in the face with a cannon from point-blank range, Johnson's petulant reaction still only benefited one team, and it wasn't his own. I have seen it said on social media, because I was flooded with bad takes after I tweeted about Carragher's comments, that whilst Johnson did give away a free kick and got himself booked, and that, yes, on the face of it, that wasn't particularly beneficial to Nottingham Forest, long term it would be because he was sending out a clear message and setting a precedent. But what precedent would that be exactly? That if you come to the City ground, you're winning, and you want to see out the game, it really won't take much to wind us up, get us to give away stupid fouls, get booked, and help you to run down the clock. I'm not quite sure still how that benefits the trees in the short, medium, or long term for that matter. There is a certain extent to which Britain has become an increasingly cold, grey, and miserable place where the only joy that people can derive comes from bad things happening to other people. I mean, emotionally cold, grey, and miserable, not just in terms of the climate, and I am not entirely joking. There is definitely a suspicion, if not a downright hatred from some people in Britain, towards creativity, flamboyance, and indeed fun. And there can be few nations on earth that derive more joy and satisfaction from seeing others fail. Both on and off the pitch, it wasn't always thus. You might have noticed, as I did, that a lot of the problems in terms of Britain's attitude towards showboating and just a general sense of resentment and spite towards others seemed to take off during the 1980s. Now, it is much too easy to blame everything that is bad about Britain on Margaret Thatcher, simply because most of it is her fault, but it does seem as though irrevocable brainworms were inflicted upon the British public from about 1981 onwards, which is around the same time that Kelvin Mackenzie was appointed as editor of the Sun newspaper, probably coincidentally, and things have been getting sometimes gradually and sometimes very rapidly worse ever since. In conclusion, football is supposed to be fun. He juggled the ball a little bit and therefore must have both of his legs broken is not a rational thought process, and the fact that either of those two facts need to be pointed out to people is indicative of a deep sickness and emotional instability among a tremendous number of people. Not to put too fine a point on this, but the cries of break his legs and snap his shins by six-fingered cave-dwelling Neanderthals on social media, who think that someone having their career or livelihood stripped of them is a suitable punishment for, again, doing some Keepie-Uppies, are deranged. I am being deadly serious when I say that anyone who reacts like that, and I do sometimes see people get that angry at football matches over remarkably banal things, has some deep underlying anger problems, is clearly incapable of controlling their emotions, and should seek help. I mean, the very notion of football fans, especially since it is the very same fans in this instance, chastising anyone for showing a lack of respect for their opponents, seems to be innately hilarious and absurd to me. If Richarlison deserved to have his legs broken for supposedly disrespecting Nottingham Forest, does that mean that every football fan that chants "Ole, ole" every time their team completes a pass when they are comfortably winning a game deserves to have any of their limbs snapped, bones broken, or be deprived of being able to do their jobs for a number of months or years? Quite obviously not. And lastly, just because I fear that a lot of the comments will come back to this point, I am not having a go at Brennan Johnson or Nottingham Forest. What he did was daft and it didn't help his team, but it wasn't outrageous or disgraceful. I am well aware that many footballers would have done likewise in the same situation, particularly young and inexperienced players. You can understand his frustration, even if he channeled it in a foolish way. My objection, and this is a hill that I am willing to die on, is to the ridiculous condemnation of Richarlison, the idea that Johnson had done anything heroic, or that he would have been justified in doing far worse, all of which, I think, point to a problem with the British psyche, at least within some circles, both within and outside of football, that I really don't think is very healthy. And just before I leave you, it seems as though Kara has doubled down on his take live on air, this time on Twitter, so just to be absolutely clear, if someone deliberately injures someone for doing Keepie-Uppies, the person who is at fault there is the person who deliberately injures someone, not the person who did the Keepie-Uppies. Much like if I am sat on a train opposite someone whose face I don't like, and I get irritated and punch them in that face, the fact that I didn't care much for their face is no justification. It is not the other person's fault that, in that scenario, I have been an overly emotional man-baby who couldn't control my thoughts and emotions and resorted to violence. Even if they were doing something that I found particularly offensive, as some people find showboating, like, let's just say, eating some really smelly crisps, again, and I assume that this is common knowledge as I don't see too many fistfights breaking out on trains, you're not actually allowed to respond by physically assaulting someone or trying to injure them. Christ almighty. That is it for today's video. Bit of a different one, I know, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I just felt I had to get that off my chest. I did a tweet about it. There was the responses, you know how it is. Anyway, yeah, hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on that very Twitter account that I've described in this video, via the username at HITC Sevens. It is also the same username on Instagram, should you wish to follow me on there as well. Cheers, and have a brilliant day.